It was just another Friday night. My son Jake was out with his friends, and I was home alone, curled up on the couch with a glass of wine. The house was quiet, too quiet. I didn't think much of it when I heard the front door open. Jake must have forgotten something, I thought. But when I turned around, it wasn't Jake standing there. It was his best friend, Ryan, and the look in his eyes. It wasn't the look of a kid who'd come to borrow a video game. His voice was shaky, nervous. I could tell something was off, but nothing could have prepared me for what he said next. "I've been thinking about you, a lot, and I can't keep it to myself anymore." In that moment, my world stopped. This wasn't just some teenage crush, this was my son's best friend, and he was looking at me like I was the only person in the room. What do you do when the line between right and wrong blurs? When the person standing in front of you isn't just a boy, but a reminder of everything you've lost and everything you're afraid to want again? This is the story of how I reacted and how one moment changed everything. Let me take you back to where it all began. My name is Claire, and I've been a single mom for the past 5 years. My husband, Tom, passed away suddenly, leaving me to raise our son, Jake, on my own. Jake was only 13 at the time, and losing his dad hit him hard. He became quiet, withdrawn, and I felt like I was losing him too. Those first few months were a blur of grief and survival. I barely slept, barely ate, and every day felt like a battle just to get out of bed. But I had to be strong for Jake. He needed me, even if he didn't show it. He'd lock himself in his room for hours, the sound of video games or music blaring through the door. I'd knock, ask if he wanted to talk, but he'd always say the same thing. "I'm fine, Mom." But he wasn't fine. None of us were. Then Ryan came into our lives. Ryan was Jake's best friend, and he'd been a constant presence in our house even before Tom passed. But after the funeral, Ryan started showing up more often. At first, it was small things, helping Jake with homework, staying for dinner, or just hanging out in the living room playing video games. But over time, Ryan became more than just Jake's friend. He became part of our family. He'd help me carry groceries, fix things around the house, and even sit with me at the kitchen table, chatting about school or his plans for the future. He had this way of making everything feel lighter, like the weight of the world wasn't quite as heavy when he was around. I remember one night, about a year after Tom died, Ryan stayed late to help Jake with a science project. It was past midnight, and I was sitting at the kitchen table grading papers for my teaching job. Ryan walked in, his hair messy and his eyes tired, and asked if I wanted a cup of tea. I laughed a little. What 16-year-old boy offers to make tea? But I said yes. He brewed it perfectly, just the way I liked it, and sat down across from me. We talked for hours that night, about school, about life, about Tom. He told me how much he missed him too, how he'd always looked up to him like a second dad. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like someone truly understood what I was going through. From that night on, Ryan became a regular part of our lives. He'd come over after school, stay for dinner, and sometimes even sleep over on weekends. Jake started opening up more, laughing more, and I could see the light slowly returning to his eyes. I was so grateful for Ryan. He brought a sense of normalcy back into our lives, a sense of hope. But as the years went by, something shifted. Ryan wasn't just a kid anymore. He was 18, tall, confident, and, well, he had this way of looking at me that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. He was just a boy, after all. But then the little things started adding up. The way he'd linger in the kitchen after dinner, offering to help with the dishes. The way he'd compliment me on my cooking, my hair, my laugh. And then there were the looks, those long, lingering looks that made my stomach flip in a way I hadn't felt since Tom. I tried to ignore it. I told myself it was harmless, just a teenage crush. But deep down, I knew it was more than that, and I knew I was in dangerous territory. One night, after Ryan had gone home, I sat on the couch, staring at the blank TV screen, and asked myself, what am I doing? This isn't right. He's my son's best friend. He's practically family. But the truth was, I couldn't deny the way my heart raced whenever he was near. The way his smile made me feel alive. And that scared me more than anything. That Friday night, everything came to a head. Jake was out with his friends, and I was alone in the house. It had been a long week, grading papers, parent-teacher conferences, and trying to keep up with everything at home. I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. I poured myself a glass of wine, curled up on the couch, and tried to lose myself in a book. But my mind kept wandering, replaying the little moments with Ryan that had been building up over the past few months. The way he'd brush against me in the kitchen, his hand lingering on mine as he handed me a dish. The way he'd smile at me, his eyes holding mine just a second too long. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew it was more than that. I didn't expect Ryan to show up, but when I heard the front door open, my heart skipped a beat. I thought it was Jake, forgetting something he needed for the night. But when I turned around, it wasn't Jake standing there. It was Ryan. He looked different, nervous, almost scared. His usual confidence was gone, replaced by a vulnerability I hadn't seen before. "Hey, Mrs. Carter," he said, his voice shaky. "Can I talk to you for a second?" I nodded, trying to keep my tone light. "Of course, Ryan. What's on your mind?" He stepped closer, his hands shoved into his pockets, and for a moment he just stood there, staring at the floor. Then he took a deep breath and said the words that would change everything. "I've been thinking about you, a lot, and I can't keep it to myself anymore." My heart stopped. I felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I didn't know what to say, what to do. I just stood there, frozen, as he took another step closer. "I know this is wrong," he said, his voice trembling, "but I can't help how I feel. You're the most amazing person I've ever met, and I needed you to know." I felt a rush of emotions, shock, guilt, and something else I couldn't quite name. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was my son's best friend. He was practically family. But the truth is, part of me didn't want to push him away. Part of me wanted to see where this would go, and that scared me more than anything. I took a step back, trying to steady my breathing. "Ryan, this isn't right," I said, my voice shaking. "I'm your best friend's mom. This can't happen." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of desperation and hope. "I know," he said, "but I can't stop how I feel, and I don't think you can either." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, because he was right. I couldn't deny the connection between us, the way my heart raced whenever he was near, but I also knew the consequences. If Jake ever found out, it would destroy him, and if anyone else found out, it would destroy me. I had to make a choice, and in that moment, I chose to walk away. "I'm sorry, Ryan," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "but this can't happen. Not now. Not ever." He nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I understand," he said. And then he turned and walked out the door, leaving me standing there, my heart pounding in my chest. I sat down on the couch, my hands trembling, and tried to process what had just happened. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions: guilt, confusion, and a strange sense of longing. I knew I'd done the right thing, but it didn't make it any easier. I poured myself another glass of wine, hoping it would calm my nerves, but it didn't help. All I could think about was Ryan, the way he'd looked at me, the way his voice had trembled when he confessed his feelings, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not yet. I took a step back, trying to steady my breathing. My heart was pounding so loudly I could hear it in my ears, and my hands were trembling. I felt like the ground had shifted beneath me, like everything I thought I knew about my life had been turned upside down. "Ryan, this isn't right," I said, my voice shaking. "I'm your best friend's mom. This can't happen." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a mix of desperation and hope. "I know," he said, "but I can't stop how I feel, and I don't think you can either." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, because he was right. I couldn't deny the connection between us, the way my heart raced whenever he was near, but I also knew the consequences. If Jake ever found out, it would destroy him, and if anyone else found out, it would destroy me. I felt a wave of guilt wash over me. How could I even be considering this? Ryan was just a boy, my son's best friend. He was practically family, but the truth was, part of me didn't want to push him away. Part of me wanted to see where this would go, and that scared me more than anything. I took another step back, putting more distance between us. "Ryan, you don't understand," I said, my voice trembling. "This isn't just about us. This is about Jake, about your friendship with him. If he ever found out—" I trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. The thought of Jake's reaction made my stomach churn. He'd be devastated, betrayed, and I couldn't do that to him. I couldn't do that to Ryan either. Ryan stepped closer, his eyes pleading. "I know it's complicated," he said, "but I can't keep pretending like I don't feel this way. Every time I'm around you, it's all I can think about. You're the most amazing person I've ever met, and I needed you to know." I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. His words were so raw, so honest, and they stirred something deep inside me. But I couldn't let myself go there. I couldn't let myself feel what I was feeling. "Ryan, I'm sorry," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, "but this can't happen. Not now, not ever." He nodded, his shoulders slumping in defeat. "I understand," he said, and then he turned and walked out the door, leaving me standing there, my heart pounding in my chest. I sat down on the couch, my hands trembling, and tried to process what had just happened. My mind was a whirlwind of emotions: guilt, confusion, and a strange sense of longing. I knew I'd done the right thing, but it didn't make it any easier. I poured myself another glass of wine, hoping it would calm my nerves, but it didn't help. All I could think about was Ryan, the way he'd looked at me, the way his voice had trembled when he confessed his feelings, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not yet. I replayed the conversation in my head over and over, trying to make sense of it. How had we gotten here? How had things between us become so complicated? I thought about all the little moments that had led up to this, the lingering looks, the casual touches, the way he'd always seemed to find a reason to be near me. I'd told myself it was harmless, just a teenage crush, but deep down, I'd known it was more than that. And now, here we were. I felt a pang of guilt as I thought about Jake. He trusted me, he trusted Ryan, and if he ever found out about this, it would shatter him. I couldn't let that happen. I had to be strong, for his sake. But as I sat there, staring at the empty doorway, I couldn't help but wonder, what if I had chosen differently? What if I had let myself feel something, even for a moment? The thought terrified me, but it also intrigued me, and that scared me more than anything. The days that followed were a blur. Ryan avoided me, and I avoided him. Jake noticed the tension between us, but he didn't say anything. I think he knew something was off, but he didn't want to push, and I didn't know how to explain it to him. How could I tell my son that his best friend had feelings for me? That I had feelings for him too? It was a secret I carried with me, a weight that grew heavier with each passing day. Every time I saw Ryan, my heart would race, and I'd feel a mix of guilt and longing. He'd walk into the kitchen, and I'd immediately find an excuse to leave. He'd sit down next to me on the couch, and I'd get up to do the dishes. It was like we were dancing around each other, both of us too afraid to say what we were really feeling. But the tension between us was palpable, and I knew it was only a matter of time before something gave. One evening, about a week after Ryan's confession, I was in the kitchen making dinner when Jake walked in. "Hey, Mom," he said, leaning against the counter. "What's going on with you and Ryan?" I froze, my heart skipping a beat. "What do you mean?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. Jake shrugged. I don't know. He's been acting weird lately, and so have you. I forced a smile, hoping it would ease his concern. Everything's fine, sweetheart. Ryan's just going through some stuff. You know how it is. Jake nodded, but I could tell he wasn't convinced. Okay, he said, but if something's wrong, you'd tell me, right? My chest tightened at his words. Of course, I said, but the guilt was almost unbearable. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and tried to make sense of everything. I thought about Ryan, the way he'd looked at me, the way his voice had trembled when he confessed his feelings. I thought about Jake, his trust, his innocence, and how much I didn't want to hurt him. And I thought about myself, my loneliness, my longing, and the part of me that wanted to give in to what I was feeling. I knew I'd made the right choice by walking away, but that didn't make it any easier. Every time I closed my eyes, I could see Ryan's face, hear his voice, feel the weight of his words, and I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. Not yet. A few days later, Ryan showed up at the house again. Jake was out with friends, and I was alone. When I opened the door, he looked nervous, his hands shoved into his pockets. Can we talk? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated, but then nodded and stepped aside to let him in. We sat down on the couch, and for a long time, neither of us said anything. The silence between us was heavy, filled with all the things we weren't saying. Finally, Ryan broke the silence. I'm sorry, he said, his voice trembling. I shouldn't have said anything. I needed you to know how I felt. I looked at him, my heart aching at the vulnerability in his eyes. Ryan, I'm not mad at you, I said, but this can't happen. You know that, right? He nodded, but I could see the pain in his expression. I know, he said, but it doesn't make it any easier. We sat there in silence for a while, both of us lost in our own thoughts. I wanted to reach out to him, to comfort him, but I knew I couldn't. The line between us was too fragile, too easily crossed, and I couldn't risk it. Not again. After Ryan left, I sat on the couch, staring at the empty doorway, and tried to process everything. I felt a strange mix of relief and sadness. Relief that we'd finally talked, and sadness that things between us would never be the same. But as time went on, I realized something. Ryan wasn't just a boy with a crush. He was a reminder of everything I'd lost, the love, the connection, the passion. And in a way, he gave me something I hadn't felt in years. Hope. Hope that maybe, just maybe, I could feel that way again. But at what cost? That's the question I still ask myself every day. In the end, I made the choice I thought was right. I put my son first, even if it meant sacrificing something I wanted. But I'll always wonder, what if I had chosen differently? What if I had let myself feel something, even for a moment? I don't have the answers. All I know is that one moment changed everything, and it's a moment I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. Looking back, I realize how fragile the line between right and wrong can be. How easy it is to blur that line when you're lonely, when you're longing for something, or someone, to fill the void. Ryan wasn't just a boy with a crush. He was a mirror, reflecting back all the things I'd lost and all the things I was afraid to want again. And in that reflection, I saw a version of myself I didn't recognize. A version that was willing to risk everything for a fleeting moment of connection. But life isn't just about what we want, it's about the choices we make and the people we protect. Jake didn't deserve to be caught in the middle of something he couldn't understand. And Ryan didn't deserve to be hurt by the weight of emotions he couldn't control. I had to be the adult in the room, even when every part of me wanted to give in. The truth is, I'll never know what could have been. Maybe things would have turned out differently if I'd let myself feel something, even for a moment. Maybe we could have found a way to navigate the impossible. Or maybe it would have destroyed everything. My relationship with Jake, Ryan's friendship with him, and the fragile sense of normalcy we'd built after Tom's death. I'll never know. and that's the hardest part. What I do know is that life is messy, it's complicated, and sometimes the right choice isn't the easy one. It's the one that hurts the most. I chose to walk away from Ryan not because I didn't care, but because I cared too much about Jake, about Ryan, about the life we'd built together, and even though it was the hardest decision I've ever made, I know it was the right one. But I'll always wonder what might have been if I'd let myself feel something, even for a moment. I'll always wonder if I made the right choice. And I'll always carry the weight of that moment with me, the moment when the line between right and wrong blurred, and I had to choose. This is my story, and this is how I reacted. It's not perfect, it's not clean, but it's real. And maybe, just maybe, it's a reminder that life is full of impossible choices. Choices that test us, that break us, and that ultimately define who we are. I don't have all the answers, but I do know this. I made the choice I thought was right, and that's all any of us can do.